I collapsed at my birthday dinner. Then my son whispered a truth that shattered my world, and then I. It was supposed to be a simple birthday, one where I could at least pretend things were normal again, but nothing could have prepared me for what actually happened that day. My son Leo, who had just turned 11 last month, decided he wanted to make me something special to celebrate, and I'll admit, I got a little emotional when he told me he and his dad had cooked up a surprise dinner for me. I sat at the dining table, smiling awkwardly while the two of them fussed in the kitchen, making way too much noise for what was supposedly just curry rice. After about an hour, Miles, my husband, called me over to eat, and Leo proudly presented a big plate piled high with steaming curry. I took a bite without thinking, expecting the usual mild flavor I used to make for him when he was little, but the second it touched my tongue, something felt wrong. My throat began to tingle first, then burn, and when I tried to swallow, it felt like my windpipe was closing. Panicking, I reached for the water glass, but the pressure in my chest was so strong I couldn't even lift it. I staggered out of my chair, clutching at my throat, trying desperately to breathe, while my vision blurred and my legs gave out beneath me. From the floor, gasping and terrified, I looked up at Miles and Leo, hoping they would call an ambulance or at least help me. But instead, I saw something that made my blood run colder than the curry burning inside me. Miles was smiling. No, grinning, and I watched in horror as he pulled a crumpled handful of cash from his pocket and pressed it into Leo's small hand, ruffling his hair affectionately. "Good job, kid," he said, like Leo had just passed a test or scored a goal, and not, as I realized in that moment, helped poison his own mother. I don't remember fainting, but when I woke up again, it was to the sterile white ceiling of a hospital room, and 4 needles taped into the back of my hand, and the beeping of a heart monitor beside me. For a few precious seconds, I thought maybe I had dreamed it all, that somehow the birthday disaster was a hallucination brought on by stress or exhaustion. Then Leo's face appeared in my blurred vision, eyes red and wet with tears, and I knew it had all been real. "Mom," he sobbed, gripping my fingers tightly in his own small hands. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know it would be like this." Confused and still groggy, I tried to sit up, only to realize that another bed had been wheeled into the room next to mine. There, hooked up to even more machines, and with a plastic oxygen mask covering his mouth and nose, lay Miles, looking pale and fragile in a way I'd never seen before. It took a while for Leo to stammer out the story, but when he did, the pieces snapped together into a picture that was worse than anything I could have imagined. Apparently, a few weeks before my birthday, Miles had started whispering promises to Leo, bribes of money, new video games, and even a brand new bicycle if he could help pull off a special surprise for me. Leo, still young enough to want to impress his dad, but old enough to know something felt wrong, played along while secretly planning to tell me everything. Miles had bought something online, a magic powder he claimed would just make the curry taste extra special, but Leo said it smelled strange, like metal and chemicals, and he was too scared to use it. In the end, Leo had pretended to sprinkle it into the food, but Miles must have gotten suspicious and added it himself. What he didn't account for was the shallow cut he had gotten on his thumb while chopping vegetables earlier. According to the doctor, whatever was in that powder got into his bloodstream through the wound, and within hours, he was collapsing the same way I had. In trying to kill me, Miles had poisoned himself too, a mistake so stupid it would have been almost funny if it hadn't nearly cost me my life. Lying there in the hospital bed, I thought back to how it had all started, to the days when I still believed Miles was a good man. I met him when I was 23 at a friend's barbecue in Charleston, South Carolina, back when the humid summers felt romantic and not oppressive. He had a confident charm about him, a way of making you feel like you were the most important person in the room. I fell fast and hard, the way only someone young and naive can, and within a year, we were married in a small ceremony that seemed sweet at the time, but now just felt like a sad joke. For a few years, things were good, or at least not terrible. We bought a modest house, had Leo, built a life that looked normal from the outside. But after my father passed away when I was 30, everything changed. My father had been a careful, shrewd man who had invested in rental properties and stocks throughout his life. And when he died, he left everything to me, the only child he trusted to manage his hard-earned wealth. Miles' eyes lit up in a way I'd never seen before when he found out about the inheritance. Not with pride or relief, but with pure, gleaming greed. Within days, he was showing me glossy pamphlets for luxury cars, sprawling vacation homes, even private yachts. When I tried to explain that the inheritance wasn't a magic ATM machine, that it was meant to secure Leo's future, not fund an endless spree of luxury spending, Miles would get sullen and angry. "You're so selfish," he hissed at me one night after I refused to buy him a limited edition sports car. "Other wives want to make their husbands happy. You just hoard your money like a miser." After that, things deteriorated faster than I could have believed. He started poisoning Leo against me, whispering in his ear that I was cheap, mean, that I didn't care about making them happy. When Leo begged me for expensive gifts and threw tantrums if I said no, I blamed myself, thinking maybe I had worked too much, missed too many of his soccer games, been too distracted by grief. I didn't realize until too late that Miles had been carefully pulling the strings the entire time, turning my own son against me in order to isolate and control me. That birthday dinner was supposed to be the final step, the last nail in my coffin, both literally and figuratively. If Leo hadn't trusted his instincts and warned me, I might not have made it out alive. And even though we were both still breathing, I knew nothing would ever be the same again. After being discharged from the hospital, I knew I couldn't simply pretend nothing had happened and slip back into the miserable routine that had taken over my life. Every time I looked at Miles, I saw the flash of his smile as I gasped for air. The image burned into my mind like a scar that wouldn't heal. Leo and I returned to the house alone for a few days, the air thick with an uneasy silence that neither of us dared to break for a while. I spent the first night sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the spot where I had almost died, while Leo hovered nearby, still watching me with guilt and fear in his wide brown eyes. I kept reassuring him that none of this was his fault, that he had been brave to tell me the truth even when it must have terrified him. But some invisible weight still seemed to crush his small shoulders. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that this wasn't something I could let go, not just for my sake, but for his too. The next morning, I went into what used to be our shared office and started gathering whatever evidence I could find before Miles came crawling back home. It didn't take long to uncover the mess he had left behind in his greed-fueled frenzy, because when desperate people act, they always leave traces no matter how clever they think they are. Inside the bottom drawer of the old oak desk, buried under outdated bank statements and tax documents, I found printed receipts from shady websites selling unregulated chemicals disguised as food additives. I spread the documents out on the desk, my heart hammering as I pieced together the timeline like a morbid puzzle no one wanted to solve. Miles hadn't just lost control one night and made a terrible mistake. He had planned this, plotted it weeks in advance, setting traps and manipulating Leo like a puppet on strings. Some of the receipts were weeks old, dated shortly after he found out about my father's final real estate deal, the one that added another 6 figures to my inheritance and sent Miles into an even deeper spiral of greed. Later that afternoon, I installed a set of cheap but effective recording devices throughout the house, hidden behind bookshelves, in light fixtures, even under the kitchen sink where he always tossed his keys when he came home. If he tried anything again, or if he let anything slip, I wanted every word recorded and ready to hand over to the police if it came to that. It felt disgusting setting traps in my own home, but I had no illusions anymore. This wasn't about love, it was about survival. Leo helped without complaining, moving quietly around the house with a seriousness that broke my heart, his childhood slipping away with every cable he taped to the wall or microphone he hid behind a curtain. He had lost the father he thought he knew, and I hated Miles even more for stealing that innocence from him. While we worked, I explained things carefully to him in a way he could understand, about how sometimes people let money twist them into monsters, about how love isn't supposed to come with conditions or threats. On the third day, Miles came home. I heard the squeal of tires in the driveway and the slamming of the front door, and for a brief moment, terror rooted me to the spot. But then Leo slid his small hand into mine under the table, and I remembered I wasn't alone in this fight. Miles entered the kitchen with a big, forced grin on his face, the kind of smile a politician gives when they know they've been caught lying. "Hey, babe," he said too loudly, tossing his coat onto the back of a chair like nothing had ever happened. "Feeling better?" I forced a tight smile back, the kind you give to a snake you can't kill just yet, and nodded without answering. He didn't seem to notice how stiffly Leo was sitting beside me, how both of us flinched slightly when he came closer. Instead, he launched into some ridiculous story about how he had accidentally bought the wrong spice for the curry, how everything was a big misunderstanding, and how we just needed to move past it for the sake of the family. It took everything in me not to stand up and scream in his face right then and there, but I knew patience was the key. Instead, I nodded along dumbly, asking just enough questions to keep him talking, recording every word as he dug his own grave deeper with every excuse and backpedal. Eventually, he shifted gears, pulling out a brand new car brochure from his messenger bag and sliding it across the table toward me with a gleam in his eye. "Look," he said, tapping the glossy page with a finger. "I found a dealership offering financing. With your inheritance as collateral, we could have this by next month. Think about how happy it would make Leo, too. We could go on road trips, show him the country like we always talked about." He said it so smoothly, so easily, like he hadn't just tried to turn our son into an accomplice to murder a few days ago. I picked up the brochure and flipped through it slowly, pretending to consider his offer while inside, my stomach churned with disgust. Each car was more extravagant than the last, flashy status symbols for a man who had never been able to stand living an ordinary life. Finally, I closed it and set it down carefully, meeting his expectant gaze with a calmness I didn't feel. "I'll think about it," I said softly, and the smile that spread across his face was almost enough to make me lose my composure entirely. After he left the kitchen, whistling as he went upstairs to shower, Leo and I sat frozen in silence for several long minutes. "You did good," I whispered finally, squeezing his hand once more. "We're going to end this. I promise." That night, while Miles slept like a man without a care in the world, Leo and I crept through the house collecting the last pieces of evidence we needed. In a dusty box under our bed, I found a contract he had signed with an exotic car dealership in Savannah, outlining an outrageous purchase he clearly intended to make once my assets became legally his. There was no mention of me anywhere in the contract, no co-signature lines, no shared ownership, just his name and a plan to trade up for a newer, younger life once the inconvenient wife had been accidentally buried. Each discovery fueled my determination more. Every lie, every betrayal, every fake smile sharpened my resolve until I felt like a blade honed on years of quiet suffering. I wasn't just going to divorce him. I was going to destroy whatever fantasy world he had built in his head where he could kill me, collect the prize, and walk away clean. When he was finally trapped, I wanted him to see it coming and know exactly who had outsmarted him. 2 nights later, I sat at the same kitchen table again, a fresh cup of coffee steaming in front of me, and waited. Miles shuffled in around midnight, still in work clothes, reeking of cheap beer and expensive aftershave. He dropped into the chair across from me without a word, rubbing his face with both hands like a man exhausted by the heavy burden of his own secrets. I slid a folder across the table toward him without speaking, my hands steady for the first time in months. He looked at it suspiciously, then flipped it open, his eyes widening with every page he turned. Purchase orders, contracts, screenshots of online poison sales, and transcriptions of his recorded conversations with Leo. The color drained from his face as the truth suffocated whatever lies he might have been preparing to tell. Finally, he looked up at me with a sneer twisted by panic and hatred. "You think this is going to save you?" he spat. "Nobody's going to believe a crazy bitch and a kid over me." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms over my chest, feeling more powerful than I had in years. "They won't have to believe us," I said quietly. "They'll believe the evidence. And by the time I'm done with you, you'll wish you had just left when you had the chance." The next morning, I woke up early with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. knowing exactly what had to be done and no longer feeling an ounce of fear about it. Miles left for work as if nothing had happened, probably thinking he had intimidated me into silence the night before, but he couldn't have been more wrong. As soon as he drove away, Leo and I got to work, packing essentials into 2 suitcases and gathering all the important documents we would need to start fresh once this nightmare was officially over. I had already spoken to a lawyer the previous evening, a no-nonsense woman named Dana who had listened to my story without once interrupting, her face getting harder and harder with every detail I shared. "You have enough evidence here to bury him," she had said bluntly, tapping the thick folder I had placed on her desk. "Attempted murder, financial coercion, fraud. He's not just looking at a divorce settlement. He's looking at real prison time." Her confidence gave me strength, but I knew it wasn't going to be easy. Miles had a temper, and desperate men did desperate things when they realized they were cornered. So we had to be careful, move methodically, and above all, keep Leo safe no matter what happened. While Leo stayed with our neighbor, a kind old woman named Mrs. Carter who thought we were just dealing with family drama, I drove downtown to file the necessary paperwork, restraining orders, emergency custody requests, and the formal divorce petition. It felt surreal standing in front of a judge that afternoon, answering questions in a small courtroom that smelled faintly of old wood and disinfectant. My hands trembled a little at first, but when I glanced over at Leo, sitting nervously on the bench with Mrs. Carter, I steeled myself. I owed it to him to be strong, to show him that monsters didn't win just because they roared the loudest. The judge granted everything I asked for on the spot, her gavel slamming down with a sound that echoed through the nearly empty courtroom like a gunshot announcing the beginning of the end. By the time I got home, the house felt different, like the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for the storm to hit. I barely had time to double-check the locks and hide our bags before Miles came barging through the front door, his face flushed with anger and confusion. "Where the hell were you today?" he demanded, throwing his keys so hard against the wall that the plaster cracked. "I called you like 20 times. I stayed calm, letting him rant and stomp around like a spoiled child denied his favorite toy, knowing that every angry word and every threat was being recorded by the devices I had hidden weeks ago. Finally, when he paused long enough to catch his breath, I handed him the thick envelope containing the divorce papers and watched as realization dawned on his face. He flipped through the pages furiously, his hands shaking, his breathing growing heavier with every paragraph he skimmed. "You think you can take everything from me?" he spat, tossing the papers onto the floor like they burned his skin. "You're nothing without me. You and that stupid kid wouldn't survive a month without my help." I laughed then, a harsh, bitter sound that surprised even me. "We already have, Miles," I said softly, feeling years of fear and resentment burning away into something clean and fierce. "And starting tomorrow, we won't have to survive you anymore." For a moment, he looked like he might lunge at me, but instead, he turned on his heel and stormed upstairs, the thud of his footsteps shaking the thin walls. I stayed where I was, heart pounding but steady, knowing the police would be arriving soon to serve the official restraining order. True to form, Miles couldn't leave without trying one last act of petty revenge, trashing the bedroom and throwing whatever he could get his hands on out the windows onto the front lawn. The officers arrived less than an hour later, calm and professional, their presence a solid wall between me and the man who had once sworn to protect me. They escorted him out in handcuffs while he shouted obscenities and empty threats over his shoulder, the neighbors peeking through their curtains like children watching a parade. It should have felt like victory, but all I felt was exhaustion, like I had been fighting a war in slow motion for years and was only now starting to feel the bruises. Over the next few weeks, things moved quickly. Miles was charged formally with attempted murder, conspiracy to commit fraud, and child endangerment, the case made airtight by the mountain of evidence I had gathered. His lawyer tried every dirty trick in the book, claiming stress, blaming me for provoking him, even suggesting Leo had misunderstood everything. But the recordings, the purchase receipts, and the hospital reports crushed every pathetic excuse like a hammer smashing glass. Watching him squirm on the witness stand was a strange sort of catharsis, a final confirmation that I hadn't imagined any of it, that I hadn't somehow exaggerated or deserved the abuse he had heaped on me for years. I sat in the front row of the courtroom every single day, Leo beside me clutching my hand tightly, refusing to flinch even when Miles tried to meet his eyes with silent, manipulative pleading. In the end, the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with a unanimous guilty verdict on all charges. The judge didn't bother to sugarcoat her sentencing either, calling Miles's actions cowardly, premeditated, and utterly reprehensible before sentencing him to 10 years in state prison without the possibility of early parole. I watched without blinking as they led him away in shackles, his face pale and slack with disbelief, and felt a deep, satisfying calm settle over me. There was still work to be done, of course. I filed for sole custody of Leo, citing the overwhelming evidence of Miles's endangerment and manipulation, and the court agreed immediately. Our divorce was finalized soon after, the settlement awarding me full control of the inheritance along with substantial restitution payments meant to compensate for the emotional and financial trauma Miles had inflicted. Not that I expected to see a dime of it. Prison wages didn't exactly go far towards six-figure debts. Miles's parents, who had once doted on him and treated me like a beloved daughter, turned their backs on him the moment the verdict was announced. When they found out about the shady contracts he had signed using my assets as leverage, they were forced to remortgage their own house to cover the penalties, and in a rare flash of decency, they came to me personally to apologize for ever doubting me. I accepted their apology but declined their offer to stay in touch, needing clean breaks to truly heal. Leo and I packed our bags one final time that summer and left Charleston behind for good, settling in Savannah where no one knew our names or our past. We rented a modest townhouse near the river, a cozy place with creaky floors and sunlight that poured through the windows every morning, and for the first time in years, we could breathe without fear clinging to our lungs. At night, Leo and I would sit on the tiny back porch with glasses of lemonade, watching the fireflies dance in the humid twilight, and talk about everything and nothing. He asked hard questions sometimes, about his dad, about whether things could have been different, but I always answered honestly, never lying to him the way Miles had lied to both of us. Our new life in Savannah wasn't perfect, but it was ours, built brick by careful brick on a foundation of honesty that no amount of past betrayal could erode again. The first few months were filled with small victories. Leo making friends at his new school, me landing a job at a local real estate agency, and the slow but steady return of laughter to our tiny home. Sometimes, the memories would catch me off guard, slicing through peaceful moments like a knife, but I refused to let them drag me back into that dark place where Miles had kept me trapped for so long. I used a portion of my inheritance to set up a savings account for Leo's future, making sure he would never have to depend on anyone else the way I once had. Every time I saw the balance grow, it felt like planting seeds in a garden that would bloom long after I was gone, a living legacy that my father would have been proud to see. I didn't buy new clothes or expensive jewelry, didn't trade my old car for a shiny replacement, because none of that mattered anymore once I understood what real wealth actually meant. It meant security. It meant choices. It meant never letting another person hold the keys to my freedom ever again. Meanwhile, news about Miles trickled in from time to time, carried by old acquaintances who hadn't yet learned that I no longer wanted updates about the man who had tried to destroy me. He wasn't adjusting well to prison life, unsurprisingly, and had already been moved twice after altercations with other inmates. His parents, who had been forced to downsize into a cramped apartment after selling their home to cover his debts, completely cut off contact after the second year, leaving him to rot in the miserable little kingdom he had built for himself. Sometimes, I wondered if he ever thought about what he had lost, if he regretted trading a family and a future for the hollow promise of status symbols he would never even own. But mostly, I didn't think about him at all. It was Leo's future that occupied my mind now, and slowly but surely, our lives began to feel less like an escape and more like a new beginning. One afternoon, about a year after the trial, Leo came home from school with a flyer for a father-son camping trip, his face shining with excitement and hope that made my heart ache. He hesitated before handing it to me, clearly torn between wanting to go and knowing how complicated that request might be. "It's okay, Mom," he said quickly before I could say anything. "Maybe we can just go somewhere together instead." I knelt down and hugged him tightly, feeling a surge of fierce love that burned away any lingering sadness. "We'll make our own adventure," I promised, and that weekend, we packed up our beat-up old sedan and drove north into the mountains, spending 2 days hiking, fishing, and sleeping under the stars in a borrowed tent. Leo never once asked about Miles, and I never once brought him up, both of us quietly understanding that the best way to honor the life we had fought so hard to save was by living it fully and joyfully. Of course, nothing stays quiet forever, and about 6 months later, an unexpected message shattered the fragile peace I had so carefully constructed. I was checking emails late one night when a subject line caught my eye. Short, stark, impossible to ignore. Request to contact. My heart skipped a beat as I opened it, finding a neatly worded note from Miles's lawyer asking if I would be willing to attend a parole hearing to give a victim impact statement. Apparently, Miles was trying to get an early release based on good behavior, a claim that would have been laughable if it wasn't so predictably desperate. For a few minutes, I just stared at the screen, weighing my options, feeling old anger and new fear warring inside me. I didn't want to see him again. Didn't want to give him the satisfaction of knowing he still occupied even a sliver of my thoughts. But then I thought about Leo, about the example I wanted to set for him, about standing up for ourselves even when it was uncomfortable. The hearing was scheduled for early spring in a bland government building 3 hours south of Savannah. I arrived early, wearing a simple navy dress and carrying nothing but a folder containing copies of my original police statements, just in case. When I was called into the hearing room, I found Miles already seated behind a scratched metal table, looking smaller and weaker than I remembered, his once proud posture reduced to a defeated slump. He didn't look at me when I entered, and I didn't look at him either. Instead, I focused on the panel of officials sitting grim-faced behind their desk, the people who would decide whether this man deserved another chance. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up, my hands steady, my voice clear, and told them the truth, not just about what Miles had done, but about what it had cost me, about the scars that didn't show up on X-rays or hospital records. I told them about Leo's nightmares, about the way he still flinched when someone raised their voice unexpectedly, about how we had been forced to rebuild our lives from ashes because of one man's selfishness and cruelty. I told them that forgiveness was a luxury reserved for those who showed genuine remorse, and that as far as I could see, Miles had only ever mourned the consequences, not the choices that had led him there. When I finished, the room was silent for a long moment, and then the head of the panel thanked me and dismissed me with a nod. I didn't wait around to hear the decision, didn't need to, because I already knew what it would be. I drove back to Savannah with the windows down and the spring air washing over my face, feeling lighter than I had in a very long time. A few days later, a letter arrived in the mail confirming that parole had been denied unanimously, citing the severity and premeditation of Miles's crimes. I showed it to Leo, who read it carefully before folding it in half and tossing it into the trash without a word. No celebration, no gloating, just quiet, solid closure, the kind that doesn't need fanfare to matter. Life went on, as it always does, and eventually, the days between thinking about Miles grew longer and longer until entire months passed without his name crossing my mind. Leo thrived in school, discovering a love for science and engineering that made me beam with pride, and I found happiness in the quiet rhythms of work, friends, and simple evenings at home. Sometimes, when I sat on the porch in the evenings and watched the sun dip behind the trees, I thought about the long, winding road that had brought us here. It hadn't been easy, and it hadn't been fair, but it was ours, carved out of pain and persistence and an unshakable belief that better days were possible. And every single time Leo called out for me from inside the house, every time I heard his laughter echo through our little neighborhood, I knew without a doubt that we had won. Months passed after the parole hearing, and life in Savannah took on a steady, comforting rhythm that I had once thought impossible after everything we endured. Leo started middle school in the fall, and every afternoon, he would burst through the front door full of stories about science projects, soccer practice, and the latest adventures with his small but loyal circle of friends. I could see the shadows lifting from his eyes a little more each day, replaced by a confidence that came from finally feeling safe and loved without strings attached or conditions set. I continued working steadily, building a modest but reliable reputation in local real estate, helping families find homes without worrying whether my own would ever feel stable again. The townhouse we rented started to feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a true home, one built not on luxury or appearances, but on real, enduring love. I didn't have anyone in my life romantically, and for the first time in a very long time, I realized I didn't need that to feel whole or happy. Then one evening, about 2 years after we first arrived in Savannah, Leo and I were having dinner on the back porch when he suddenly asked a question that stopped me cold. "Mom," he said between bites of spaghetti, "do you think you'll ever get married again?" For a moment, I didn't know how to answer, because the truth was complicated in ways I wasn't sure a 13-year-old could understand. I set down my fork carefully, thinking through my words before speaking. "Maybe someday," I said finally, "but only if it's someone who makes both of us feel safe and happy." Leo nodded thoughtfully, and there was no judgment or sadness in his expression, only curiosity and a maturity that made my heart ache with pride. "Okay," he said simply. "I just want you to be happy, Mom." That night, after he went to bed, I sat outside alone, staring up at the stars scattered across the velvet sky, and realized that for the first time since the day I married Miles, my future felt like it belonged entirely to me again. It wasn't long after that conversation that I met Ethan, a man who would eventually become an unexpected and welcome part of our lives. We met at a charity event for the local library, both of us volunteering to help sort donations, and struck up an easy conversation that turned into coffee, then dinners, and eventually lazy Sunday afternoons spent wandering the art district downtown. Ethan was nothing like Miles, and that alone would have been enough to pique my interest. But what truly drew me to him was the way he treated Leo from the very beginning, with respect, patience, and genuine kindness. He never tried to replace anything or anyone, never forced himself into spaces where he wasn't invited, and slowly, over months, he became a quiet, steady presence in our lives. When Ethan finally met Leo properly, it was during one of our regular weekend picnics at Forsyth Park, and I'll never forget the moment Leo offered him half of his sandwich without hesitation. It was such a small gesture, but it meant everything, a sign that maybe, just maybe, we could have something good again. Ethan understood my need to move slowly, to rebuild trust brick by careful brick, and he never once pressured me for more than I was ready to give. When I eventually told him everything, about Miles, about the inheritance, about the courtroom battles and sleepless nights, he listened without flinching or offering platitudes. He simply held my hand and said, "I'm sorry you went through that, but I'm glad you're here." It wasn't a fairy tale, and honestly, I didn't want one anymore. Fairy tales had always been lies dressed up in pretty colors, hiding the real, messy work of building a life worth living. What Ethan and I had was better, honest, grounded, rooted in mutual respect, and a shared understanding that love wasn't something you could buy or demand. It was something you built every single day with patience and kindness and a willingness to forgive, but never forget the lessons that had kept you alive. Eventually, about a year after we started dating seriously, Ethan proposed quietly on a warm summer night, down by the river where we had shared our first kiss. There was no elaborate setup, no hidden photographers or grand gestures, just the two of us, a simple gold ring, and a question spoken so softly it could have been missed if you weren't listening closely enough. I said yes, not because I needed him to complete me, but because he made the life I had built with Leo richer, warmer, and infinitely more joyful. We married the following spring in a small ceremony by the water, with only a handful of close friends and family in attendance. Leo stood beside me as my best man, grinning proudly in his too big suit, and afterward, we all celebrated with barbecue, laughter, and a bonfire that burned long into the night. There were no NDAs, no private yachts, no overpriced hotel rooms. Just love, real and messy and perfect in its imperfection. In the years that followed, life unfolded in ways both expected and surprising. Leo grew into a thoughtful, brilliant young man who eventually earned a scholarship to study engineering at a top university, and every milestone he reached felt like another victory over the darkness that had once threatened to consume us. Ethan continued to be a steady presence, cheering Leo on at every game, helping him with impossible homework problems, and sometimes just sitting quietly with him during the hard moments when words weren't enough. As for me, I finally started writing again, something I had abandoned during the worst years with Miles. I turned our story into something bigger than myself, a memoir about survival, resilience, and the hard, painful beauty of starting over. It wasn't easy dredging up those memories, but it felt important, necessary, like leaving a trail of breadcrumbs for anyone else lost in the dark to find their way out. The book was modestly successful, not a bestseller or a movie deal, but enough to connect me with people who had lived through similar nightmares and needed to know they weren't alone. Every email, every letter from a stranger saying, "You helped me," was worth more than any check or award could ever be. And through it all, the inheritance remained mostly untouched, carefully invested, and growing quietly in the background like a protective wall around everything Leo and I had built. I wasn't hoarding it out of fear anymore, though. I was preserving it out of love, a gift to my son, and maybe someday, to his children too. Proof that the roots we plant in kindness can outlast even the most violent storms. Sometimes, late at night, I would think about the woman I had been all those years ago, the one who thought love meant sacrifice, who believed loyalty meant enduring cruelty, who stayed silent because she was too afraid of what would happen if she spoke. I mourned her sometimes, but I never pitied her, because she had fought like hell to survive, and without her, I wouldn't be here to tell the story. Life didn't hand me a second chance. I took it, bloody and broken and determined, and turned it into something beautiful. And I would never, ever let anyone take that away from me again.